Brazil's right-back crisis. The real problem isn't performance, it's fitness. Brazil's biggest problem at the moment may not be a lack of talent, creativity, or even tactical options. The real problem is something much more frustrating and much harder to control: injuries. And when we talk specifically about Brazil's right-back position, that problem becomes even more serious. Brazil actually has two extremely talented right-backs who can perform at the highest level: Vanderson and Wesley França. There is very little you can criticize about their footballing ability. When they are fit and available, both players have shown that they can contribute at a very high level. But there is one major question hanging over both of them. Can they stay fit consistently enough for Brazil to depend on them? That is the issue Carlo Ancelotti now needs to solve. Because at the World Cup, Brazil learned the hard way that having talented players is not enough. You also need reliable depth, especially in positions where injuries can completely change your tactical options. And right back is one of those positions. Let's start with Vanderson, because his absence has been particularly frustrating for Brazil. Vanderson is exactly the kind of modern attacking fullback that Brazil needs. He is energetic, aggressive, comfortable moving forward, and capable of contributing on both sides of the game. Defensively, he can track runners, make interceptions, compete in tackles, recover possession, and provide important defensive cover on the right side. But what really makes him valuable is what he can do when Brazil has possession. Vanderson is excellent at overlapping, pushing into space, supporting the right winger, and helping Brazil create numerical advantages down the flank. At Monaco, we have repeatedly seen him provide that kind of support. He can move forward without completely abandoning his defensive responsibilities, and that balance is extremely important for a team like Brazil. Brazil does not simply need a defender at right back. They need a player who can help build attacks, stretch the opposition, create passing options, and still recover quickly when possession is lost. Vanderson can do all of that. That is why, when he is fit, there is a very strong argument for trusting him completely. His biggest problem has never really been his performances. It has been his availability. A serious ACL injury earlier in 2026 disrupted his season and ultimately prevented him from being part of Brazil's World Cup plans. Even though he worked his way back toward fitness before the tournament, the timing simply did not allow him to become a realistic World Cup option. And unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. Vanderson has repeatedly had fitness problems that have interrupted his availability for Brazil. That is becoming a pattern, and it is exactly the kind of pattern Ancelotti cannot afford to ignore. Think about the situation from the national team's perspective. You can have one of the most talented right-backs in your squad, but if he is unavailable every time an important international window arrives, the coaching staff has no choice but to look elsewhere. That is where the problem begins. And then there is Wesley França. If Vanderson represents one side of Brazil's right-back dilemma, Wesley represents the other. Wesley has tremendous potential and offers a slightly different profile. He is dynamic, explosive, technically capable, and comfortable operating in aggressive attacking positions. During his time at Flamengo, he established himself as a promising young fullback, and his performances eventually earned him a move to European football with Roma. But since making that transition, injuries have become a much bigger part of the conversation around him. That is something Brazil cannot ignore. At Flamengo, Wesley's availability was not the major concern it has become since moving to Europe. Since joining Roma, he has dealt with multiple injury setbacks, and that has interrupted his rhythm at crucial moments. For a young player trying to establish himself at both club and international level, that can be extremely damaging. And for Brazil, it creates another problem because Wesley was one of the most important options at right back heading into the World Cup. He was not simply a fringe player. He was a player Brazil could realistically have used as a major option in that position. Unfortunately, an injury shortly before the tournament disrupted his preparation, and he was unable to give Brazil the availability and consistency the team needed. That is why the right-back situation became so complicated during the World Cup. Brazil had talent, but they did not have enough certainty, and that distinction is incredibly important. If Vanderson and Wesley were both completely healthy, Brazil probably would not have a major crisis at right back. In fact, the position could be considered one of the team's strongest areas. The problem is that a national team tournament does not allow you to plan around if everyone stays healthy. You have to plan for the possibility that someone gets injured at the worst possible moment. And Brazil experienced exactly that. So, in my view, the question is not whether Vanderson and Wesley should remain among Brazil's main right-back choices. They absolutely should. The question is, who is the reliable third option? Because if both players are fit, great. But if one gets injured, Brazil needs another player who is actually ready to step in, not someone who is being called up simply because there is no other choice. Carlo Ancelotti, therefore, needs to start looking beyond the obvious names. There are several Brazilian right-backs who could potentially enter the conversation. One name is Paulo Henrique, who plays for Vasco da Gama. Another is Yen Kudo, who has continued his European journey and is now associated with Como. There is also Dodo, a player Brazilian fans are already familiar with, and who has experience at the European level. Vitinho is another name who could potentially be monitored, although he may not currently be the strongest option compared with the others. And there are likely other players on Ancelotti's radar who could emerge depending on their club form, development, and fitness. The point is not that Brazil needs to immediately replace Vanderson or Wesley. Quite the opposite. Brazil should continue to trust both players. But trust and preparation are two different things. You can fully trust your first-choice players while still preparing for the possibility that they will not be available. That is exactly what Ancelotti should be doing now. The biggest lesson from the World Cup should be that Brazil cannot afford to be caught without adequate depth. If a key player gets injured during a tournament, you cannot suddenly start searching for solutions. The solution has to be prepared months in advance. That means Ancelotti and his staff should be monitoring right-backs consistently, not just looking at statistics or highlight clips. They need to watch their defensive consistency, attacking contribution, tactical intelligence, physical condition, versatility, and, perhaps most importantly, their injury history. Because for Brazil, fitness has become just as important as ability. And there is another step that I believe could be extremely important. Communication between the national team and the players' clubs. If Vanderson and Wesley continue to suffer recurring injuries, Brazil's medical and performance departments should be communicating closely with their respective clubs. The national team needs to understand what is causing these recurring problems, whether there are workload issues, recovery problems, muscular imbalances, training-related concerns, or simply bad luck. Of course, injuries are part of football, and not every injury can be prevented. But if a player repeatedly misses international duty because of fitness issues, then the national team cannot simply accept the situation without trying to understand it. Workload management could also become an important part of the solution. Both players need to be physically prepared for the demands of international football, but they also need to arrive at national team camps without being overloaded from their club schedules. Brazil should be looking at the bigger picture rather than treating every injury as an isolated event. And that brings us back to the main point. Brazil does not necessarily have a right-back talent crisis. Brazil has a right-back availability crisis. There is a huge difference between those two things. Vanderson and Wesley have the talent. They have the ability. They have shown enough quality to justify being considered among Brazil's leading options. But Brazil needs to make sure that at least one of them, and ideally both, can stay healthy and available when the biggest matches arrive. At the same time, Ancelotti must develop a genuine backup plan. If Vanderson and Wesley are healthy, nobody is asking for dramatic changes. But if one or both are unavailable, Brazil needs a player who can enter the team without creating another major weakness. That is the real challenge. The right-back position is not broken, but it is fragile. And fragility becomes dangerous when you are preparing for a World Cup. Brazil cannot repeat the same mistake of entering a major tournament with talented options but insufficient insurance behind them. Ancelotti has time to fix this. He can monitor potential replacements, watch their club performances, communicate with medical teams, evaluate their fitness, and gradually introduce the best candidates into the national team setup. Vanderson and Wesley remain two players I would absolutely continue to support. There is no question about their footballing quality. The question is whether their bodies will allow them to consistently show that quality when Brazil needs them most. So now, The conversation should not be about throwing these two players away or replacing them completely. It should be about protecting them, managing their workload, understanding their injury problems, and building a reliable safety net behind them. Because if Brazil can solve that one issue, the right-back position could quickly go from being a major concern to becoming a position of strength. And in the coming videos, we can take a much closer look at the possible backup options. Who they are, what they offer, how they fit Ancelotti's system, and which players could realistically challenge for a place in Brazil's squad. So now I want to hear from you. Do you trust Vanderson and Wesley as Brazil's main right-back options? And if one or both of them are unavailable, which Brazilian right-back would you choose as their replacement? Let me know your picks in the comments.